It is estimated that nearly 30 million children in the US eat school lunch every day. The logistics that make this task a possibility are infinitely complex, but the policies and politics behind this program are equally, if not more, fascinating. The school lunch program is one of the longest standing social programs in the country, and it's been a fight to maintain it. The national program wasn't founded until 1946, but efforts to feed school children healthy food on a regular basis began almost 70 years before the act was established. The school lunch program has had a long and at times difficult battle, but it has survived for longer than any other social programs, due to, by in no small part, the efforts of countless politicians, academics, and at times surprising civil rights groups. By the end of this video, when you think about school lunch, you'll think about more than just a rectangular slice of sheet pan pizza, a cardboard pint of chocolate milk, and half-thawed frozen vegetables served on a segmented plastic tray. You'll think about a legacy of social programming pioneers and civil rights, and you'll wonder if ketchup is really a vegetable.
And for a vegetable, there will be ketchup. These are redefinitions of child nutrition standards proposed.
The earliest efforts to feed children in US schools started towards the end of the 19th century during the Progressive Era. Compulsory or mandatory education wasn't quite the norm yet, but in cities like Boston and Philadelphia, there was a requirement for all children to attend school. These two cities would become the birthplace of the school lunch program. But we are going to focus on two key figures that were leading the charge to feed kids at scale. The first is an entrepreneur and business owner named Edward Atkinson, and the second is a woman named Ellen Richards.
She was instrumental in starting to develop this science of nutrition. And she and a number of other women had ideas about basically the diets of working class people, especially working men. Who were immigrants, largely immigrants, and for whom food was relatively expensive. My name is Susan Levine, and I'm a professor emerita from the University of Illinois at Chicago from the history department.
Edward Atkinson was heavily invested in figuring out how to feed low-income workers nutritious food, but more importantly, he wanted to do this on a tight budget. He understood that if you could teach people how to make undesirable pieces of meat that typically would be inedible into something you could at the very least choke down without much effort, this would satisfy workers' appetites, which would make them less hungry, and that would make them more productive. If this implementation was effective, he wouldn't have to increase workers' wages. While socially, his ideas weren't necessarily progressive, economically they made sense, but one of the biggest contributors to dietary reform and ultimately the school lunch program that he would make would be a financial investment into Ellen Richards. Richards was the first woman to be admitted to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, commonly referred to as MIT. She graduated in 1873 and later became the institution's first female instructor. Through the financial backing of Atkinson and the newly discovered nutritional science of a guy named Wilbur O. Atwater, Ellen Richards started a public kitchen in Boston. But there was a problem. The food was dull, unseasoned, and it lacked flavor. And the attempts to feed workers scientifically engineered gruel, it didn't go over too well.
So when we're talking about, we'll call it Americanization, because that's what they called it in the early 20th century, there is a big push to Americanize through food, which frustrates a lot of immigrants because for them, food is their strongest and best connection to the homeland, right? A lot of, America's immigrant history, people are coming somewhat voluntarily, but they're coming in distress, right? They're in economic distress. My name is Sarah Wasberg Johnson, and I am a food historian.
Ellen Richards is also commonly referred to as the founder of home economics. She believed that a well-fed and educated society would make America stronger.
Which I think is really important and something that's perhaps forgotten in the present moment.
I was going to say, don't say anything, John. I can only guess how you feel about it currently. Yeah. Whew.
Advocates for school lunch during the 19th century widely understood that you could strengthen the country by feeding and educating the youth. They also knew that the minds of children are much easier to change than their parents, so children were seen by many social reformers as a way to slowly assimilate immigrants into the culture of the United States.
But those reformers are typically white. They're typically middle and upper class. They're highly educated in a very specific type of education and culture. And some of them are very well-meaning. Some of them learn that, hey, these people have agency and they should not be forced to give up this stuff. Other people are like super racist and eugenicists and are saying you need to Americanize and embrace the supremacist culture in this country, which is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. So, but then that is typically, the kind of, we'll call it the vibe of reformers. Not everybody, like I said, contributes to that or tries not to, but it is definitely the norm.
While the progressive era did see the birth of school lunch, and there were many successful programs that fed workers and children at this time, it would be several decades before a national lunch program was launched. Unfortunately for our girl Ellen, it wasn't really viewed as a necessity to have a well-fed and educated nation during her time. Having a well-fed population wouldn't be seen as a national priority until we needed soldiers to fight the First World War. During the First World War, a shocking number of young men were rejected by the military because they were underweight or suffered from a variety of medical conditions caused by malnutrition. This included rickets, poor teeth, or simply being underweight. Schools, hospitals, and some factories even started running meal programs, and they were piggybacking off of the groundwork laid by Ellen Richards. But the increase in food production and distribution came with unintended consequences.
So, World War I, the United States government encourages farmers to dramatically increase production, right, to feed Europe, which is not producing agricultural products. The government is encouraging farmers to produce. We're selling to the Allies, and then post-war, there's a crash, right? There's an agricultural depression. And the agricultural depression basically precedes, that's like kind of the canary in the coal mine for what becomes the Great Depression.
Somehow it didn't last forever. In the 1920s, the great American word was prosperity. Now the 30s have begun, and there is a new word, depression.
So during the Great Depression, you had this sort of social paradox going on. On one hand, you had people facing severe privation, with many Americans seated right on the edge of starvation. And in some situations, you had people that were literally starving to death. On the other hand, you had a completely different problem. An abundance in agricultural products and high demand was driving down the price of goods. The economy was collapsing. The solution the government came up with was to start paying farmers to produce less. But there was still a giant problem. What do you do with all of the surplus goods already on hand? If distribution was to continue, markets would sink even further. Panicked, farmers halted and blocked distribution of goods. They even dumped and disposed of food items. One of the most extreme examples of this happened in the Midwest with pig farmers. The plan that the government came up with? It was to get ahead of market saturation. So they issued an early slaughter of 6 million baby pigs. Farmers were paid to hand over the animals, and they were sent off to facilities. But these facilities, they were designed for full-grown hogs, not babies. These piglets would easily escape from their cages, and they went squealing down the streets of Omaha, Nebraska. As you can imagine, the destruction of agricultural commodities while Americans were literally starving, that didn't go over too well. Newspapers and radio broadcasts across the country were not kind to the administration in charge of these decisions. FDR was being chastised, and he knew he needed to do something different. The American public was hungry and angry. How can you destroy all of this good food while people are dying? That's what people wanted to know, and it's a fair question. But social programs and the notion of helping poor people, especially immigrants, wasn't necessarily an idea that many Americans were interested in previously. However, when everyone started needing help, the cultural opinion on government assistance started to shift rapidly. It was during this era that we started to get New Deal programs, and more importantly, as it pertains to the history of school lunch, this is where we get government intervention from the Department of Agriculture. If farmers had excess commodities, the Department of Ag would purchase the goods and use it to feed people who were in need. This helped to keep farms from bankrupting, but feeding needy children became less about nutrition and more about just giving them whatever surplus was on hand. For example, there are stories from this era where a school would be given so many apples that attendants would start to find them in toilets and the trash. Or they would be given surplus olives and kids just wouldn't eat them. There were certainly issues with this new method of feeding those in need, but the kinks in this new system would never get a chance to be sorted out because another crisis would force America to become even more organized in their attempts to feed citizens.
Your commentator is Joe O'Brien. Naval plane base were the first objectives of Japan's treachery. Scores of planes were bruised and battered by the Japs' aerial bombs. Many of these were demolished beyond repair.
Coming out of the Depression and into World War II, the war really boosted the American economy, sad to say, or good to say, depends on how you look at it. But it was a war that really kind of consolidated the economy and especially agriculture, because there was a large market for army rations and for food and lots of other goods as well.
And we don't want to have another crash. We don't want to have another agricultural depression. So the government has to figure out what are we going to do with all this surplus. And the easiest thing to do with that surplus is for the government to buy it.
This led to Harry Truman passing the National School Lunch Act of 1946. This act would later be renamed in 1999 to the Richard B. Russell Act, named after a senator from Georgia who authored and championed the original legislation for the act. But there was a bit of a problem with Russell and his hidden motives.
Which schools got lunch, which children got lunch, depended on the states and local school districts. So the reason I'm saying that is because in the first 15 years of the program, it was a very segregated program. And even though schools in the South and Southern senators supported the program, most of the time, Black schools were not were barely part of the subsidy.
This wasn't an accident. It was done by design. In a statement from his 1936 re-election campaign for the U.S. Senate, Richard Russell said, "This is a white man's country, yes, and we're going to keep it that way." And then in a confidential letter, he made this statement, "Any Southern white man worth a pinch of salt would give his all to maintain white supremacy." This was quoted by Robert Caro in his book, Master of the Senate. Then in 1956, 2 years after the unanimous decision by the Supreme Court in the case Brown v. Board of Education to overturn this separate but equal doctrine, a piece of legislation that deemed segregation practices to be unconstitutional, Russell helped write a document called the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, also known as the Southern Manifesto, in an attempt to counter the Supreme Court's ruling, calling it an abuse of power. When I think about political leaders like this, I often wonder if someone like Russell was a white supremacist just for the sake of maintaining dominance in the cultural hierarchy, or was there some other hidden motivation here? I asked Sarah, and this is what she said.
A lot of poor people in the United States are minorities because of institutional racism,
Yeah,
right? And
sure.
the legacy of slavery and racism toward immigrants and all that fun stuff. So that is, I think, why there's this anger and this kind of backlash against government support for the poor, right? Also, from a business perspective, when you have poor people who are desperate, they'll work for lower wages. They'll do more for less, right? When you're desperate. So if you can't feed your kids, you're gonna take on more jobs that are not very well paying, and do more with less, right? So, I don't know that that is necessarily a thing that is explicitly discussed in, corporate boardrooms. Like, let's end school lunch so we can make people desperate and they'll work for lower wages. Maybe it is, but that's definitely, I think, something that is part of this concept of who is allowed to have a good, successful life and who isn't. So there's elements of racism and there's elements of of corporate greed in both of those things.
Unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. It would be easier to shrink from that new frontier, to look to the safe mediocrity of the past, to be lulled by good intentions and high rhetoric, and those who prefer that course should not vote for me or the Democratic Party.
Inside of the post-World War II society, there was such a boom in the economy that a large part of the collective American consciousness, especially inside of the minds of white, well-to-do Americans, people just kind of forgot that poverty was a thing. Malnutrition and abject poverty, they were talked about, but never as a domestic issue. These topics were only discussed as if they existed abroad, internationally. But in the 1960s, these things were illuminated in a way that they had never been illuminated before, with campaigns from people like John F. Kennedy and his New Frontier program, and another initiative by Lyndon B. Johnson dubbed a war on poverty.
All Americans must have the privileges of citizenship, regardless of race. And they are going to have those privileges of citizenship, regardless of race.
In 1967, a civil rights attorney named Marion Wright would urge Robert Kennedy to take a trip to the Mississippi Delta. Kennedy was accompanied by a photographer, and these images provided some of the most illuminating images from the era. For those that were paying attention, they were forced to admit that at least for some people, the American dream was more like a nightmare. Liberals had long bemoaned segregation, Jim Crow-era laws, and discriminatory practices, especially in the South. But they hadn't done much to enact any sort of systemic change. Part of the reason the School Lunch Act passed in the first place was Northern Democrats capitulated to Southern Democrats that wanted to maintain segregation. Basically, Northern congressional leaders said they would turn a blind eye to racist practices of Southern Democrats if they helped to get the National School Lunch Act passed. But there was at least one exception to this. A New York representative named Adam Clayton Powell Jr. had introduced an amendment to the 1946 Act that would prohibit any funds going to schools that, to quote, makes any discrimination because race, creed, or national origin of children, or between types of schools, or with respect to a state which maintains separate schools for minority and for majority children. It discriminates between such schools on this account. This amendment is now referred to as the Powell Amendment, and while it was accepted by Congress in 1946, it wasn't codified until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, at a time where people were starting to pay attention to inequality more than ever before.
And especially in the urban areas, people began to notice that this school lunch program was not equally distributed and it was not equally available. And there was actually a pretty interesting survey by a group of women a coalition of women's groups who were affiliated with the civil rights movement, but it was the National Council of Negro Women, National Council of Jewish Women, a bunch of different women's community groups.
The person who oversaw the organizations of these different community groups was an American educator, civil rights worker, community organizer, and philanthropist named Jean E. Fairfax, which is an important name that you'll need to remember for the end of the video. Over the course of 18 months, Jean Fairfax organized these different organizations and launched a well thought out and coordinated investigation into the National Lunch Program. Each organization set out to find who was getting lunch, what they were getting, and who was being left out. The results from the study of the National School Lunch Program were published in a 1968 report called Their Daily Bread, and she went on to say, "The common thread throughout our diverse religious traditions is concern for the poor. We are aroused to collective action when we discover that a program designed for the nurture of children is failing to reach those who need it most." While progress was being made through legislation, you had other activist groups with a more boots-on-the-ground approach. A free breakfast program was started in Oakland, California in 1969 by the Black Panthers. Within a year of starting the program, every city with a Black Panther Party chapter, a total of 36 cities, had a free breakfast program. Some estimates say that upwards of 20,000 kids were fed breakfast for free. Ruth Beckford helped coordinate the program in Oakland, and she said, "The school principal came down and told us how different the children were. They weren't falling asleep in class. They weren't crying with stomach cramps."
Meeting the basic food needs, I think, is really critical for student success. If you come to school without proper nutrition, we know that kids are not going to be successful.
That was Neil Gore, a community leader in an area with individuals facing financial barriers that in the year 2025 are still being affected by the political battle of school lunch. We'll hear more from him in a later part of the video when we talk about the current state of the lunch program, but for now, back to the Black Panthers free lunch program. While the Panthers are mostly known for their military-style approach to social activism, what's rarely talked about is their social endeavors like the free breakfast program, transportation assistance, education, free health clinics, tuberculosis and sickle cell anemia testing, legal aid, and free school for homeless and low-income and Black communities. Point being, many of the Panthers' efforts for Black liberation were peaceful and community building, but not everyone was a fan of this. The most notable opponent of the party was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who instructed the department's counterintelligence program to spread misinformation about the Panthers' free breakfast. One of the rumors was that the food was poisoned. Hoover would continue his assault on the Panthers by instructing raids on the breakfast programs, where agents destroyed food, and in one report I read, agents literally urinated on all of the remaining products just to make sure nothing edible was left.
When the Black Panthers are, a radical armed political group, they're much easier to pigeonhole than when they start making, financial, economic difference in people's lives. And the Black Panthers breakfast program, a lot of the political operatives at that time were very threatened by that because the Panthers welcomed everybody for their breakfast. And if the Black Panthers could get support for people outside of the African American community, that was seen as dangerous. Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't get assassinated until he starts talking about economic justice.
And the economic problem is probably the most serious problem confronting the Negro community. And I might say the most serious problem confronting poor people generally. And I don't want to be narrow about this, talking only about the Black poor in our country, because I must be concerned about Puerto Ricans who are poor, Mexican Americans, American Indians, and Appalachian whites. And we are confronting a major depression in the poor community.
All of the efforts of the countless participants in the civil rights movement came together at the end of the 60s when an unlikely figure stepped in to help expand one of the nation's oldest social programs.
We don't know just how many Americans are actually hungry, and we don't know how many Americans suffer from malnutrition, who eat enough but do not eat the right thing. But we do know there are too many Americans in both categories.
Richard Nixon, who was not known as the most liberal president, expanded the school lunch program and in the sense that he expanded it to serve poor children, to expand the access to free lunch programs.
Just as poor children won a right to lunch, the quality of meals declined as the democratic ideal of the school lunchroom disappeared. Shortly after his inauguration, Nixon and his administration set out to end hunger by Thanksgiving. And while this may have been an audacious goal, it certainly does demonstrate that there was at least an awareness of the growing concern over poverty and hunger in the country. Nixon oversaw an expansion to the food and nutrition program at a scale that the American public had never seen before. But these initiatives bottlenecked when it came to funding. As the amount of free lunches increased, so did the problems. Two notable issues were, one, the stigma of free lunch, or reduced lunch, and the second was how to fund it. In regard to stigma, reduced or free lunches were associated with poor children. That stigma, paired with the rising cost of pay lunches, caused an alarming amount of paying children to abandon the school lunch program entirely. This was a problem for funding, because traditionally paid lunches were used to offset the cost of free lunches. Another problem for Nixon and his efforts to feed the needy was the ongoing war in Vietnam. The war was making him quite unpopular as inflation was high and the cost of food was soaring. All of this culminated in the decision to bring on a man who would change school lunch and the food landscape in America forever.
But our agricultural policy as a nation starts to shift in the 1970s under an agricultural secretary named Earl Butz Jr. His famous line is "get big or get out," which is saying you have to increase the size of your farm or you're not going to be competitive. He wants people to plant fence row to fence row, so you don't have the conservation methods or measures that had been in place previously. And he scraps the how farm loans were structured. They got rid of the farm loan program and went instead to subsidies, which said, okay, instead of giving you a loan, right, the government will guarantee you a price for your crop, and we're going to make it a market floor. So if the cost of your crop on the free market drops below a certain threshold, the government will pay you the difference. Well, of course, what happens to the free market when they know that there's a price floor and the government is going to pay the difference? The prices immediately start falling below that floor. And so you get, food processors are suddenly able to purchase food for less than it costs to produce. And so because they're getting these commodity crops so cheaply, they can spend money on processing. So you can turn corn into corn syrup. You can turn soybeans into soybean oil, and you can spend a whole bunch more money transforming those things into other, we'll call them food-like substances.
This era ushered in the beginning of Congress pulling back from funding to welfare programs, and by the mid-1970s, the Department of Agriculture had already began loosening nutritional guidelines for school lunch. The lack of federal support and the loosened nutritional guidelines opened the door for private funding. As school lunch contracts shifted towards privatization, fast food companies like McDonald's, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell became eager allies. This trend of an unregulated market wasn't showing any signs of slowing down either.
The present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan wasted no time on making budgetary cuts. One of the first targets on his list was children's nutritional plans, particularly school lunches. $400 million was removed from the budget immediately, with another $1.4 billion being eliminated by the following year. This accounted for nearly a quarter of the National School Lunch Program's budgets.
And for a vegetable, there will be ketchup. These are redefinitions of child nutrition standards proposed by the Department of Agriculture. But here in the Tidewater area, schools are coping without such drastic ketchup and peanut substitutions. Prices for school lunches have been raised from 5 to 20 cents this year to combat costs and cutbacks.
There was a push in the Department of Agriculture, as you say, to sort of start to deregulate or to cut back on government subsidies. Not a lot, a little different from today, but similar. And one of the ways that they decided to do that was in shifting the nutritional recommendations for school lunch, and not really shifting them, but jiggering with them. And one of the things that the Secretary of Agriculture wanted to do was to cut the costs of fresh fruits and vegetables.
In Virginia Beach, the schools are focusing on decreasing labor costs by preparing simpler meals.
He said, well, there are tomatoes and ketchup. It can count as the vegetable part of the meal, which it was really absurd. And he took it back fairly quickly. It didn't really go anywhere, but it became a kind of symbol, a political symbol of opposition to cutting back on public programs.
Candy, soda, and foods of minimal nutritional value started becoming ubiquitous amongst modern-day school cafeterias. Food items had to have a minimum of just 5% of the RDA, or required daily allowance, to be suitable for the school cafeteria, meaning that if a candy bar had at least one nut in it, or jelly beans if they were fortified with vitamin C, then they met the requirements. Privatization, deregulation, and ever-loosening nutritional guidelines continued to be the trend up until present day.
But schools had to try and keep things affordable for families, so they turned to contracts, right, with other companies. And man, the 90s was like the heyday for fast food in schools. Pizza Hut and Domino's and whatever else, would get a contract with the school as a concessionaire, right? And then they would get the school lunch money, and they would provide this food that was not particularly good for the students who were eating it. So
for the last 30 years, there have been several attempts to change the nutritional standards for school lunch. But broadly speaking, the programs have remained relatively unchanged since the time of Ronald Reagan. Giant corporate entities that value profit above all else still have a presence in school cafeterias. There are some loose guidelines for nutrition, and while ketchup isn't considered a vegetable, tomato paste still is. Literally, it's a thing. And that's why many school children in 2025 will immediately recognize the rectangle pizza as being synonymous with school lunch. However, if we've learned anything throughout this video, it's that there are always people fighting for the ability for children to have free and healthy food.
There's a lot of local activity, and there are a lot of places that are experimenting with school food programs and trying to connect schools to local farmers, and it should have more support than it does.
When Susan told me about contemporary initiatives to feed children, this inspired an idea for me to reach out to a local community leader here in my home city of Indianapolis.
My name's Neil Gore, and I am a family liaison at a Title I elementary school in the Indianapolis area.
Neil repeated to me a concept that was understood as early as the 1870s by people like Ellen Richards. Kids that are well fed, they simply learn better. This improves the lives of children, their families, and communities in a real and measurable way. If you're not well fed, you suffer in school. You don't get a proper education, you enter the job market at a disadvantage, and while it might sound dramatic, this has a rippling effect that literally can change the life expectancy in cities.
In the greater Indianapolis area, there's a 16-year life expectancy difference based on zip code alone.
I want to share a personal story with you really quickly. 10 years ago, when I was a single dad who had recently been awarded custody of my son attended the school that Neil Gore works at. After going through a long custody battle, I ended up dropping out of college in Florida and moving back to Indiana to be near my family. Needless to say, I didn't have a lot of resources. My son and I, we benefited from the programs through Neil's school. I started learning new skills with my camera by volunteering with Neil's programs. My son and I got free dinner at a time where every cent mattered, and I'll probably live a longer, healthier life in some part due to the work that Neil does. I know it can feel overwhelming when you hear stories like this and you may feel like you're helpless. So if you want to help, I have two ideas. The first idea is to find a local program with a school near you and to go volunteer. There are local organizations like this all around the country. The second thing you could do is donate to an organization called A Longer Table. It's a nonprofit in Indianapolis, the city that I live in, that teaches children how to cook, it teaches them about nutrition, and it's doing what you might call the Lord's work. There is a link to donate in the description of this video, and if you decide to donate, I just ask that you include my name where it says, "Why did you make your gift today?" Thanks for listening. Back to the story.
We have our own kitchen that's fully equipped, but still I would say a majority of what I see coming through are heat and serve type items. So, but that's part of the American diet, right? The standard American diet.
Instead of local farmers being subsidized to feed local schools, currently major companies like Compass, Aramac, and Sodexo are given government reimbursements. The school district that Neil works in is classified as a Title I school, so about 90% of the students qualify for free or reduced lunch, so almost the entire school is being fed mass-produced, ultra-processed food from these major corporations.
You've got chicken nuggets, you've got chicken patties, you have pizza, you have walking tacos with name brand tortillas. Those are kind of the standard fare that we see. So you don't see a lot of scratch-made things in kitchens. We know more about brain function than we've ever known before. And we know what sugars and we know what ultra-processed foods are going to a child's brain. And those are the things we know of, right? And so you think about the 16-year life expectancy difference. You think about and that's life expectancy, not quality of life or, the quality of health care or the overall health of a child. We know these things are harmful. And yet it's 70 to 90% of what our kids are eating.
I asked Neil, if we know how dangerous it is to feed kids such unhealthy food, why do we keep doing it?
I mean, what's the motivation behind a lot of this? Is big profits off of our children. literally shortening their lives. Like you said, these are things that we know are harmful. Some of the products we're feeding our kids are outlawed in other countries, and yet we continue to choose to put them in and target kids with these things that we know are harmful for them. And it's shameful, right? It's shameful that we're focusing our priority of the importance of money over the welfare of our kids. In the richest country in the history of the world, we're more concerned about our profit margins than we are about the health of our children.
Here's what Sarah said when I asked her if she has any hope for the future of the school lunch program.
I will say, as a historian who studies the progressive era and the sort of turn of the 20th century, I am hopeful that we're coming into a second progressive era, and that we'll hopefully learn the lessons of the mistakes of the first progressive era. But I think you are getting, young idealists or not so young idealists who are looking at the income inequality and saying that this is not right and we should do something about it.
But the reality of the situation right now is that government funding, it is being cut, the same way it was in the early 1980s. Nutritional guidelines are still much too lenient, and we need people like you to start getting involved, to start caring. We need another Gene Fairfax. And speaking of Gene Fairfax, I want to end this deep dive into overlooked history on a positive note. On March 6 of 2025, Representatives Bonnie Watson Coleman and Al Green introduced a bill to rename the National School Lunch Act from the Richard Russell Jr. Act to the Gene E. Fairfax Act. Now, how likely is it in the next 3 years this bill gets codified and the name is changed? It's not looking good. But if and when it does, that would be a symbol for hope, and that would be so nice. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for being here. And since you're here at the end, why don't you just go ahead and subscribe to the channel? I desperately want to get a YouTube plaque so that way my kids think I'm cool. I've got to do some research and some writing because I'm a real person and I make these videos myself. Fuck AI, fuck the robots, peace.